Drop one tray, and you might lose your job, but utter one wrong word in this room, and you'll disappear forever. Isabella Moreno stood at the threshold of the lion's den, her white shirt and black vest a stark contrast to the predatory shadows of the Moretti mansion. This wasn't just a high-paying catering gig. It was a walk through a minefield where New York's most dangerous men decided who lived and who died with a single whispered word. Isabella's heart thundered against her ribs as she approached the center table, where the iron-fisted patriarch, Don Silvano, sat gripping a silver-headed cane. She was strictly instructed to remain invisible and never make eye contact. But as she leaned in to serve the Don, a phrase she hadn't thought of since her grandfather's bedside lessons slipped out instinctively. Sangadiyu Emo Usengu. The clatter of silverware stopped instantly. The air in the ballroom turned to ice as the city's most lethal men reached for their holsters. Isabella realized her catastrophic mistake. She had used the king's dialect, an ancient phrase of blood allegiance. As the frail patriarch stood up for the first time in years to face her, Isabella knew she hadn't just served a drink. She had declared a war. Drop one tray, and you might lose your job, but utter one wrong word in this room, and you'll disappear forever. The head steward's voice was a jagged whisper against the back of Gianna Vance's neck, cold enough to make the fine hairs on her arms stand up. She adjusted the lapels of her black vest, her palms slick against the fabric. Gianna wasn't supposed to be here. She was a substitute, a last-minute fill-in for a girl who had caught one look at the guest list and developed a sudden, convenient fever. But the money offered for a single night at the Moretti estate was enough to stall the foreclosure on her grandfather's house for 3 months. And for that, Gianna would have walked through fire. The Lion's Den, as the staff called the grand dining hall, lived up to its name. The air was thick, not just with the scent of expensive tobacco and aged scotch, but with the suffocating weight of power. Men in silk suits that cost more than Gianna's education sat around a mahogany table that stretched the length of the room, their faces carved from granite and secrets. These were the architects of the city's shadows, the men who decided which ships docked and which ones sank. Gianna kept her chin tucked, her gaze anchored to the polished tips of her sensible black shoes as she navigated the perimeter of the room with a silver tray of vintage Cabernet. She was a ghost. That was the rule. In this world, the invisible were the only ones who survived. She moved with practiced grace, refilling glasses without breaking the heavy, low-frequency hum of conversation. Her heart thundered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage, but she kept her breathing shallow and even. At the head of the table sat Don Silvano. He was a man who looked like he had been forged in the volcanic soil of Sicily and tempered by decades of New York winters. His hands, gnarled and spotted with age, rested atop a cane topped with a silver lion's head. Beside him sat Lorenzo, his heir, a man with eyes like shards of flint and a mouth that looked as though it had forgotten how to smile. Lorenzo's gaze was a physical weight, scanning the room with a predatory alertness that made Gianna's skin crawl. As she approached the Don, the conversation at the table drifted into a dense, rapid-fire dialect of Italian. Not the polished version she'd heard in movies, but something older, harsher, and more rhythmic. It was the sound of her childhood, the sound of the stories her grandfather, Matteo, used to whisper to her when the lights were low and the world felt safe. Don Silvano reached for his glass, but his fingers, stiff with tremors, fumbled. The crystal tilted, and a splash of deep red wine bloomed across the white linen tablecloth like a fresh wound. The room went silent. The tension snapped taut, a wire ready to break. The bodyguards positioned by the door shifted, their hands moving instinctively toward the shadows of their jackets. Gianna didn't think. She didn't calculate the risk or remember the steward's warning. She saw an old man, frustrated and embarrassed, and her grandfather's voice echoed in her mind. She stepped forward, her linen napkin already in hand to dab the spill. And as she reached out, she looked directly into the Don's clouded eyes. The words left her lips before she could catch them. Not in English, not even in standard Italian, but in a dialect so archaic it sounded like a chant. Sangue di uemo sangue, niente si perdi sotto usili. Blood of my blood, nothing is lost under the sun. The effect was instantaneous and terrifying. The clatter of silverware against porcelain stopped as if a conductor had signaled arrest. Lorenzo Moretti froze, his glass halfway to his lips, his flint-gray eyes locking onto Gianna with a lethal intensity. One of the men down the table stood up, so abruptly his chair screeched against the marble floor, his hand disappearing into his waistband. Gianna felt the blood drain from her face. The tray in her left hand felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. She had used the king's dialect, a phrase her grandfather had insisted was a family blessing, but in this room, it was a thunderclap. It was the ancient greeting of the Valente line, a bloodline that was supposed to have been extinguished in the Great Purge 30 years ago. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. Gianna felt the cold barrel of a hidden threat pointed at her back. She had broken the first rule of the house. She had made herself seen. Then, the impossible happened. Don Silvano, a man who hadn't stood without assistance in nearly 3 years, gripped the lion-headed cane. His knuckles turned white. With a low, guttural groan of effort, he pushed himself upward. His joints popped in the silence, a sound like dry wood snapping. Lorenzo reached out to steady him, his face a mask of shock, but the old man shoved his son's hand away with surprising strength. The Don stood tall, his chest heaving, staring at Gianna, as if she were a ghost returned from the Mediterranean mist. His eyes, once clouded, were now burning with a sudden, sharp clarity. The other men at the table watched in a state of suspended animation, their faces pale. "Say it again," the Don rasped, his voice sounding like grinding stones. Gianna's throat was dry, her voice a mere thread of sound. It was just a phrase my grandfather taught me, sir. I didn't mean any disrespect." "The phrase," Silvano commanded, stepping toward her, the silver lion's head trembling. "Sangue mo sangue," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Upatu escritu enenalosa." "The pact is written in the bones." The Don let out a long, shuddering breath that sounded like a sob. He turned his head slowly toward his son. "Lorenzo, do you hear the ghost? Lorenzo? Do you hear the sea calling?" Lorenzo stepped forward, his eyes never leaving Gianna's face. He didn't look angry. He looked like a man who had just seen a dead queen walk through his front door. He looked at her white server's shirt, her trembling hands, and then at the shape of her jawline, a shape that mirrored the portraits hidden in the Don's private study. "Who are you?" Lorenzo asked, his voice a low, dangerous velvet. "I'm just a waitress," Gianna stammered, backing away as the head steward rushed forward, his face purple with panic, babbling apologies and trying to grab her arm to drag her away. "Get your hands off her!" Don Silvano roared, the sound echoing off the vaulted ceilings. The steward recoiled as if he'd been struck. The Don looked back at Gianna, a terrifyingly gentle smile touching his lips. "You're no waitress, Pixarita. You're the debt I thought I could never pay." He looked at the room, at the lethal men who served him, and raised his cane. "The dinner is over. Clear the room. Now." As the confused and wary guests began to file out under the watchful, suspicious eyes of the guards, Lorenzo stepped into Gianna's path, blocking her exit. He was inches away now, the scent of cedar and expensive leather surrounding her. "You aren't going anywhere," Lorenzo whispered, his gaze tracing the terrified lines of her face. "You just started a war, and I think you're the only one who can end it." Gianna looked at the silver tray she was still holding, then at the powerful men who were now surrounding her like a wall of iron. The quiet life she had struggled to maintain, the bills, the anonymity, the safety, it was all gone. By speaking the language of her blood, she had walked out of the shadows and into a spotlight that would either crown her or consume her. The Don sat back down, watching her with a hunger that wasn't for food but for the past. "Welcome home, Valente," he whispered. Gianna's world tilted. The wrong phrase had just changed her life forever. The heavy mahogany doors swung shut with a thud that sounded like a tomb ceiling, leaving Gianna trapped in the opulent silence of the dining hall. The air was thick with the scent of spilled wine and old secrets. Lorenzo Moretti stood barely 3 feet away, his presence a physical pressure that made the room feel smaller. He was studying her not as a woman, but as a puzzle, or perhaps a threat that needed to be neutralized. His flint-gray eyes scanned her face, tracing the bridge of her nose and the curve of her jaw as if looking for the ghost of someone he had once known. "Who taught you those words?" Lorenzo's voice was a low, dangerous velvet. He took a step closer, invading her personal space. "That dialect hasn't been spoken in this city since before I was born. It's a dead tongue from a dead house. So, how does a waitress in a cheap vest carry the greeting of the Valente sovereigns?" Gianna gripped her silver tray so hard her knuckles turned white. "My grandfather," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Matteo Vance. He used to say it every night. He told me it was a blessing for protection. I didn't know it meant anything to people like you. People like us?" Lorenzo's lip curled into a mirthless smile. He reached out, his fingers brushing the fabric of her sleeve, sending a jolt of electricity and terror through her. "Gianna, there is no one else like us. If what my father believes is true, you aren't just a girl who knows a phrase. You're a walking miracle or a walking target." Don Silvano remained seated at the head of the table, his breathing labored but his eyes bright with a feverish intensity. "The girl speaks the truth, Lorenzo," the old man rasped. "Look at her. Look at the fire in those eyes. She has her grandmother's spirit. Matteo didn't just teach her a blessing. He gave her the key to the kingdom. He knew that one day, the blood would call to the blood. Father, if the Lucchese's find out a Valente is breathing New York air, they will burn this city to the ground to finish what they started," Lorenzo said, finally turning his gaze to the patriarch. His tone was cold, clinical. "We are in the middle of a delicate transition. Bringing a ghost into the light is suicide. It is justice." Silvano slammed his lion-headed cane against the floor. "The Valentes were the kings of the waterfront. We were their sword, and we failed them. We watched as the Lucchese's slaughtered them and stole the shipping routes that built this empire. If this girl is Matteo's blood, then the debt must be paid." Gianna felt like a spectator at her own execution. "I don't want an empire," she interrupted, her voice gaining a desperate strength. "I want to go home. I have a shift at the diner tomorrow, and my grandfather needs his medicine. Please, just let me leave. I won't tell anyone what happened here." Lorenzo turned back to her, and for a fleeting second, his expression softened into something resembling pity. "You don't understand, Gianna. You didn't just speak. You signaled. The cameras in this room have already sent your face to every server in the Moretti network. Within an hour, the Lucchese scouts will have your name, your address, and your social security number. You can't go back to that house. If you walk out those doors alone, you won't make it to the end of the driveway." The reality of his words hit her like a physical blow. The small, quiet life she had built, the graveyard shifts, the chipped coffee mugs, the smell of her grandfather's old books, was dissolving. She thought of Matteo, frail and silver-haired, sitting in his armchair waiting for her. If these men knew who she was, then he was in more danger than she was. "My grandfather," she gasped, the tray finally slipping from her fingers and clattering onto the rug. "He's alone. If they're coming for me, they'll go to him first." Lorenzo reacted instantly. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a sleek, black encrypted phone. "Marco, take a tactical team to the Vance residence in Queens. Extract the old man. Bring him to the waterfront loft. If anyone resists, clear the path. Do it now." He looked at Gianna, his eyes hard again. "He's being moved, but you belong to the Morettis now. For your safety, and for mine." "I don't belong to anyone," Gianna snapped, though her knees felt like water. "You belong to history," Don Silvano corrected gently. "Lorenzo, take her to the safe house. Do not let her out of your sight. The Lucchese's will be looking for a waitress. They won't be looking for the woman who sits beside the Moretti heir." Lorenzo nodded curtly. He moved toward Gianna, grabbing her coat from the chair where she had left it. "We're leaving through the service tunnels. The front gate is already compromised." As he led her through a hidden door behind the velvet curtains, Gianna felt the world of the lion's den vanish behind her. They descended a narrow stone staircase, the air growing damp and smelling of earth and old stone. Lorenzo moved with a silent, feline grace, his hand firmly on the small of her back. He wasn't just guiding her, he was guarding her. "Why are you doing this?" she asked as they reached a reinforced steel door at the bottom of the stairs. "A moment ago, you said having me around was suicide." Lorenzo stopped and turned to her in the dim light of the tunnel. He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw, a gesture that felt dangerously intimate. "My father is a man of honor, Gianna. He wants to pay a debt, but I'm a man of strategy. And I realize that the girl who knows the king's dialect probably knows where the Valente ledger is hidden." "The ledger?" Gianna frowned. "I don't know anything about a ledger. My grandfather only has his old poetry books and recipe journals." Lorenzo's eyes flared with a sudden, sharp interest. "Poetry and recipes? Written in that same dialect?" Gianna nodded slowly. "Yes. He said they were family secrets. I used to read them to him when his eyes started to fail." Lorenzo let out a short, sharp laugh that held no humor. "Those aren't recipes, Gianna. They are the coordinates to every untraceable shipping lane in the Atlantic. They are the keys to the city's wealth. No wonder the Lucchese's wanted your family dead." He pushed open the steel door, revealing a black armored SUV idling in the shadows of an underground garage. "Keep those recipes in your head, Gianna. They're the only thing more valuable than your blood right now." As he ushered her into the back of the darkened vehicle, Gianna realized the scale of the trap she had fallen into. She wasn't just a waitress or a lost heir. She was a living map to an empire. And the man sitting next to her, the cold and beautiful Lorenzo Moretti, was either her savior or the most dangerous man she would ever meet. The SUV lurched forward, speeding into the night toward the Brooklyn waterfront. Gianna watched the lights of the city flicker by, wondering if she would ever see the sun as a free woman again. The black SUV tore through the rain-slicked streets of Brooklyn, a silent predator cutting through the neon haze. Inside, the air was pressurized, heavy with the scent of Lorenzo's expensive cologne and the metallic tang of fear. Gianna watched the blurred lights of the city through the tinted glass, her mind racing toward her grandfather's small, drafty house in Queens. Every time a siren wailed in the distance, her heart skipped a beat, imagining the Moretti tactical team crashing through her front door. Or worse, the Lucchese's getting there first. "You're shaking," Lorenzo said. It wasn't a question. He didn't turn to look at her, but she could feel his attention fixed on her reflection in the window. "My grandfather is 84 years old," Gianna snapped, her voice trembling. "He has a heart condition and a routine. He doesn't handle tactical extractions well. If your men hurt him, I don't care what dialect I speak or what ledger you think I have. I will never help you." Lorenzo turned then, his flint-gray eyes reflecting the passing street lamps. "My men are professionals, Gianna. They're trained to handle assets with care. And right now, Matteo Vance is the most precious asset the Moretti family owns. He's a person, not an asset," she shot back. "In this world, the distinction is a luxury you can no longer afford," Lorenzo replied coldly. He looked down at his phone as it buzzed. "They've reached the house. Perimeter is clear. Extraction is underway." He showed her the screen. A grainy, thermal feed showed figures moving with surgical precision through a familiar living room. She saw the silhouette of her grandfather, clutching his worn cardigan shut, being guided gently toward a waiting van. Relief flooded her, so sharp it felt like a physical pain in her chest, but it was quickly replaced by a cold realization. They were now both prisoners of the Moretti name. The SUV veered toward the industrial skeleton of the Brooklyn waterfront. They pulled into a nondescript warehouse that looked like 1,000 others, but as the heavy steel shutters rolled up, it revealed a high-tech fortress. The interior was a vast, open-concept loft with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the East River, shielded by ballistic glass and a sophisticated array of security monitors. "This is your home for the foreseeable future," Lorenzo said, ushering her out of the vehicle. "It's a secondary safe house. Even my father's inner circle doesn't have the codes. Gianna walked to the window. The Manhattan skyline glittered across the water, beautiful and indifferent. How long? Until the Lucchese's are no longer a threat. Or until you give us the leverage to end them, Lorenzo said, tossing his jacket onto a leather sofa. He walked to a sleek kitchen island and poured 2 glasses of water, sliding one toward her. Tell me about the poetry books, Gianna. Tell me about the recipes your grandfather made you memorize. Gianna ignored the water. She paced the length of the room, her server's shoes squeaking on the polished concrete. They were just stories, tales of the old country, of ships that sailed without lights, and coves that didn't appear on any map. He told me the recipes were for the king's feast, but the ingredients were weird: degrees, minutes, nautical miles, and names of stars. Lorenzo's eyes sharpened. The Valente cipher. It's legendary. For 30 years, the Lucchese family has controlled the docks, but they've never been able to find the deep water channels or the offshore drop points that the Valentes used to bypass customs. They've been looking for the physical ledger, but Matteo was smarter than that. He didn't leave a book. He left a person. I'm not a map, Gianna whispered, her skin crawling. You are the map, Lorenzo corrected. And that makes you the most dangerous woman in New York. If the Lucchese's can't have you, they will make sure no one else does. As if on cue, the wall of monitors near the entrance began to flash red. Lorenzo crossed the room in 3 strides, his hand moving to the weapon holstered at his hip. He tapped a command into the console, and the exterior cameras flickered to life. Gianna gasped. Outside the warehouse, 3 black sedans had screeched to a halt, blocking the exit. Men in tactical gear, similar to Lorenzo's but bearing a different insignia, a jagged red crest, leaped out, weapons drawn. Lucchese scouts, Lorenzo hissed. They tracked the SUV's signature. They're faster than I anticipated. What do we do? Gianna's voice rose in panic. You said this place was a fortress. It is, Lorenzo said, his face hardening into a mask of lethal intent. But a fortress is only as good as its defense. He grabbed a heavy tactical vest from a locker and threw it to her. Put this on. Now, get behind the reinforced pillar in the kitchen and don't move unless I tell you to. Are you going to fight them alone? Lorenzo checked the magazine of his pistol with a practice click. I'm never alone, Gianna, but I'm the only one here right now. The first thud hit the door, a heavy mechanical ram. The sound echoed through the loft like a heartbeat. Gianna scrambled behind the marble island, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She watched Lorenzo move with terrifying efficiency, dousing the lights until the room was bathed only in the flickering blue glow of the monitors and the distant city lights. The door groaned under a second strike, then a third. Lorenzo, she cried out as the steel frame began to buckle. Stay down, he commanded. Suddenly, the glass of the skylight shattered. A flashbang grenade dropped through the ceiling, exploding in a blinding white light and a deafening roar. Gianna covered her ears, screaming as smoke filled the room. Through the haze, she saw shadows dropping from ropes, Lucchese hitmen coming from above. The room erupted into chaos. The sharp, rhythmic cracks of Lorenzo's gunfire echoed through the loft. He was a shadow among shadows, moving with a grace that was both beautiful and horrific. He took down the first 2 men before they hit the ground, but more were pouring in through the breech door. Gianna crawled deeper into the corner of the kitchen, her eyes stinging from the smoke. She saw a man in a red-crested vest leveling a rifle toward the kitchen island. He hadn't seen Lorenzo yet, but he had spotted her. Lorenzo, behind you, she screamed. Lorenzo spun, firing a split second before the hitman could pull the trigger. The man went down, but the distraction allowed another attacker to lung at Lorenzo from the side. They crashed into a glass table, shattering it into a million diamonds. Gianna watched, paralyzed, as Lorenzo struggled with the assassin. This wasn't the cold, calculated boss she had seen in the dining hall. This was a man fighting with a raw, primal desperation. She realized then that he wasn't just fighting for the ledger or the Moretti legacy. He was fighting for her. Just as a third man approached the struggling pair with a raised knife, the warehouse shutters erupted. A barrage of gunfire tore through the Lucchese sedans outside. Moretti reinforcements. Lorenzo shouted over the din, throwing his attacker off and delivering a finishing blow. Within minutes, the loft was swarmed by men in black. The Lucchese hitmen were either dead or retreating into the night. The silence that followed was even more jarring than the noise. Lorenzo stood in the center of the wreckage, his shirt torn, blood trailing down his temple. He was breathing hard, his chest heaving. He looked toward the kitchen, his eyes searching frantically until they landed on Gianna. He crossed the room and reached over the island, pulling her up by the arms. He didn't say anything at first. He just held her, his grip tight and possessive. Gianna buried her face in his chest, her heart hammering against his tactical vest. "They know you're here," Lorenzo whispered into her hair, his voice rough with adrenaline. "This was just the beginning. They won't stop until they've burned everything down to get to you." Gianna pulled back, looking at the destruction around them. "Then we have to stop them first. The recipes, I remember the one for the midnight docks. It's a coordinate for the Lucchese's main supply line." Lorenzo looked at her, a slow, dark fire igniting in his eyes. The waitress was gone. In her place stood the last Valente, ready to reclaim her blood. "Then let's go to work, Gianna," he said. The safe house felt like a cage of glass and steel, the morning light reflecting off the river with a harsh, clinical brightness. Gianna didn't sleep. She spent the hours before dawn pacing the length of the loft, her mind a frantic library of her grandfather's voice. She realized now that Matteo Vance hadn't just been telling her stories to pass the time. He had been conducting a decade-long briefing. Every recipe for sea-salted base was a navigational chart. Every poem about the constellations was a timeline for the tides. "You're doing it again," Lorenzo said, appearing from the hallway. He had changed into a clean black shirt, but the dark bruise blooming across his temple was a stark reminder of the night's violence. He carried a laptop and a stack of physical maps. "You're staring into the distance like you're reading a script written on the air." "I am," Gianna admitted, turning from the window. "The midnight docks recipe. I always thought it was strange he insisted on 42 grams of salt and 71 grams of flour. It wasn't about the food, Lorenzo. Those are the coordinates. 40.72 degrees north, 74.01 degrees west. That's the North Cove at the Battery." Lorenzo set the maps down on the marble island, his eyes tracking the numbers. He circled a point on the chart. "That's a restricted zone. High security, heavy patrol. If the Lucchese's are using that for their supply line, they aren't just bribing customs. They've bought the entire Port Authority. It's the perfect place to hide a ghost fleet." He looked at her with a newfound intensity. The Valente ledger wasn't just about routes. It was about the ghost channels, natural deep water trenches that sonar doesn't pick up correctly because of the silt density. "If you can give me those, we don't just hurt the Lucchese's. We bankrupt them." Gianna hesitated. "My grandfather told me that the Valente family fell because they grew too proud of their secrets. If I give this to you, Lorenzo, what stops the Morettis from becoming exactly what the Lucchese's are now?" Lorenzo stepped closer, the space between them crackling with an unspoken tension. He reached out, his hand hovering near her cheek before he pulled back, as if reminding himself of the boundaries between them. "My father wants to restore the old ways, honor, blood, and tradition. But I see the writing on the wall, Gianna. The world is changing. Law enforcement is getting smarter, and the shadows are shrinking. I don't want to just be a boss. I want to be legitimate. With your family's routes and my infrastructure, we could move away from the business and into global logistics. Legal, untouchable, and massive. You want to go straight?" Gianna asked, her voice skeptical. "I want to survive," Lorenzo corrected. "And I want you to survive with me." The moment was interrupted by the chime of the security console. Gianna stiffened, her hand flying to the tactical vest she still wore. Lorenzo checked the feed, his posture relaxing only slightly. "It's my father's encrypted line. He's at the secondary safe house with Matteo." He patched the call through. The screen flickered to life, showing the interior of a library. Don Silvano was sitting in a high-back chair, looking stronger than he had at the dinner. Beside him sat Matteo Vance. Seeing her grandfather's face, Gianna felt a sob catch in her throat. "Grandpa!" she cried, leaning toward the screen. "Gianna, Pixarita," Matteo said, his voice shaky but warm. He looked tired, but his eyes were sharp. "I'm sorry I kept the weight of the crown on your shoulders for so long. I thought if I hid you in the kitchen, the world would never find you. I was an old fool. You were protecting me," Gianna said. "But I know now. I know about the recipes." Matteo nodded solemnly. "The Lucchese family. Nico Lucchese specifically. He's the one who gave the order 30 years ago. He's been searching for the Valente ledger ever since. He thinks it's a physical book. He doesn't know that the ledger is the girl who used to bake bread at his feet." "Nico Lucchese," Lorenzo intervened, leaning into the camera's view. "He's been quiet for years, father. Why surface now?" "Because he's dying," Don Silvano answered, his voice grim. "He wants to leave a legacy of total control to his son. He knows that without the Valente routes, the Lucchese Empire is a house of cards. He's desperate, and a desperate wolf is the most dangerous." "Matteo," Lorenzo said, his tone respectful. "Gianna has already identified the North Cove. But we need the entry key, the specific frequency or signal the Valentes use to navigate the silt banks." Matteo looked at Gianna through the screen, a silent communication passing between them. He sighed. "The song, Gianna. The one about the lighthouse that lost its light." Gianna closed her eyes, humming the tune she had heard 1,000 times. The notes were haunting, a minor key that seemed to vibrate in her chest. As she hummed, she visualized the sheet music Matteo had drawn in the margins of her childhood books. The notes weren't just music, they were a digital frequency. "It's a radio signal," Gianna realized, opening her eyes. "Low frequency, 12.4 kilohertz. If you broadcast that while entering the cove, the automated buoy system shifts. It creates a lane." Lorenzo's fingers flew across his keyboard. "I'm checking the port registry. My God, there it is. A dead signal that's been pinging for 30 years. No one knew what it was for." He looked at Gianna, a look of pure admiration on his face. "You've just given us the front door to their entire operation." "We can't just attack," Gianna said, her voice firm. "They have my address, my life. If we hit them, they'll kill everyone I've ever known." "We aren't going to hit them," Lorenzo said, a dark smile playing on his lips. "We're going to haunt them. We're going to use the ghost channels to bleed their shipments dry before they even reach the pier. We'll show the other families that the Luccheses can't even protect their own water." As Lorenzo began barking orders to his lieutenants over the encrypted comms, Gianna felt a strange shift within herself. The fear was still there, but it was being armored by a cold, calculating resolve. She wasn't just a server anymore, and she wasn't just a victim. She was a Valente. She walked over to the table and picked up a pen, beginning to draw the maps from memory. The hidden coves, the secret warehouses, the names of the men her grandfather had told her were loyal to the old crown. Lorenzo paused, watching her work. He saw the transformation in her eyes, the self-doubt being replaced by an iron will. He walked over and placed his hand over hers, not to stop her, but to steady her. "Tomorrow, we go to the docks," Lorenzo said quietly. "We reclaim what's yours." "Not mine," Gianna said, looking him in the eye. "Ours." The alliance was sealed, but as the sun began to set over the river, Gianna knew the hardest part was yet to come. The Lucchese family wouldn't go quietly, and the recipes she carried were written in blood. The hospital wing was a sterile contrast to the industrial grit of the waterfront. But for Gianna, the smell of antiseptic felt more like a warning than a comfort. Under the pseudonym Mrs. Thorne, her mother had been moved to a private floor, guarded by 4 men whose suits hid the silhouettes of submachine guns. Lorenzo had promised total security, yet as Gianna stood by the window of the intensive care unit, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were inside a glass jar waiting to be shattered. "She looks peaceful," Lorenzo said, his reflection appearing in the glass beside her. He wasn't wearing his tactical vest today, but the way he scanned the hallway behind them proved he was still on high alert. She has no idea that the world she tried to hide me from has finally swallowed me whole, Gianna whispered, watching the steady rhythm of the heart monitor. She changed our names, moved us 6 times before I was 10, and worked 3 jobs just to keep us off the grid. She knew the Lucchese's were still looking for the Valente blood. She was a smart woman, Lorenzo replied. But names are just clothes. Blood is the body. You can't hide it forever. The quiet of the floor was suddenly punctured by the sharp, rhythmic chirping of the elevator bay. Lorenzo's hand moved to his holster instantly. On the security monitor at the nurse's station, the feed showed 3 men in delivery uniforms stepping out, carrying large floral arrangements. They were moving too fast, their eyes scanning the ceiling for cameras rather than looking for room numbers. Red crests, Lorenzo hissed, recognizing the subtle tilt of their gait. They aren't here for a delivery. They're here for the extraction. Before Gianna could scream, the delivery men dropped the vases. Shards of ceramic sprayed across the floor, revealing compact firearms hidden within the bouquets. The hallway erupted into a cacophony of suppressed gunfire. Lorenzo tackled Gianna to the floor just as a burst of bullets shattered the window of the nurse's station, raining glass down like frozen tears. "Stay under the bed," Lorenzo commanded, his voice a roar over the chaos. He kicked the heavy hospital door shut and engaged the deadbolt, then dragged a heavy equipment cart to blockade it. Gianna scrambled into the narrow space beneath her mother's bed, her heart hammering so hard she feared it would give out. Through the gap, she saw Lorenzo take a position by the door, his pistol leveled at head height. The sound from the hallway were horrific, the grunts of men in hand-to-hand combat, the wet thud of bodies hitting the linoleum, and the relentless zip-zip of silenced rounds. "Lorenzo, there's a service hatch in the ceiling," Gianna shouted, pointing to the maintenance panel. "If they get through that door, we're trapped." Lorenzo glanced up, then back at the door, which was already beginning to splinter under the weight of shoulder check. "I'm not leaving you, and I'm sure as hell not leaving your mother." He grabbed a heavy oxygen tank from the wall, twisting the valve until it began to hiss violently. He shoved it against the door. "When I say crawl, you move toward the bathroom. It's reinforced." The door burst open. The first attacker lunged through the gap, but Lorenzo was a blur of lethal motion. He fired 2 rounds into the man's chest, then used the body as a shield against the incoming fire from the hallway. The room became a whirlwind of white sheets, flying medical supplies, and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Gianna watched in terror as a second hitman climbed through the shattered window from the outside ledge. They were coming from the exterior as well. She realized then that this wasn't just a hit. It was a coordinated siege. The Lucchese's were willing to destroy a hospital to end the Valente line. The tank Gianna, "Get back," Lorenzo yelled. He fired a single shot into the base of the hissing oxygen cylinder. The resulting explosion didn't level the room, but the sheer force of the pressure release acted like a concussive grenade, throwing the attackers back into the hallway and filling the room with a cloud of white vapor. In the confusion, Lorenzo lunged for the hitman on the window ledge, grappling with him on the precipice. For a heart-stopping second, both men teetered over the 5-story drop. Gianna screamed, scrambling out from under the bed. She grabbed a heavy metal 4-pole and, with a surge of ancestral rage she didn't know she possessed, swung it with all her might at the attacker's head. The metal connected with a sickening crack. The man's grip loosened, and he tumbled backward into the New York night. Lorenzo pulled himself back inside, gasping for air, his face smeared with soot and blood. He looked at Gianna, then at the 4-pole in her shaking hands. A grim look of respect flashed in his eyes. "Remind me never to get on your bad side, Valente." But the victory was short-lived. More footsteps were echoing in the stairwell. "We have to move her," Lorenzo said, looking at Gianna's unconscious mother. "The extraction team is 3 minutes out, but we won't last 3 minutes." "The service elevator," Gianna said, pointing to the hidden door behind the linen closet she'd noticed earlier. "My grandfather told me that the men who built this hospital were old Valente loyalists. They put in emergency exits for the family. Lorenzo didn't hesitate. He unhooked the monitors, keeping the essential life support battery active, and together they pushed the heavy bed toward the hidden service door. They entered a narrow, freight-style lift just as the main door to the room was blown off its hinges. As the lift descended in the darkness, Gianna collapsed against the side of the bed, her breath coming in ragged sobs. Lorenzo stood over her, his hand resting on the handle of the bed, his eyes fixed on the floor indicator. "They won't stop, will they?" she asked. "No," Lorenzo said, his voice cold and hard as iron. "Nico Lucchese has realized that you are the only thing standing between him and total irrelevance. He's not just trying to kill you anymore. He's trying to erase the very idea of you." He reached down, taking her hand. His palm was warm and calloused, a sharp contrast to the cold metal of the hospital bed. But he forgot one thing. The Morettists don't just protect what's ours. We burn down anyone who touches it. When the doors opened at the basement level, a fleet of black Moretti ambulances was waiting, sirens silent but engines humming. As they loaded her mother into the lead vehicle, Lorenzo turned back to the hospital, where smoke was beginning to billow from the fifth-floor windows. "The time for hiding is over, Gianna," Lorenzo said. "If they want a war in the streets, we'll give them one. But first, we're going to find out who gave them the floor number. Some of my inner circle is breathing Lucchese air." Gianna looked at her mother, then at the man who had just risked his life to save a woman he didn't even know. She realized that the nervous waitress had died back in the dining hall. The woman standing here now was someone Nico Lucchese should be very, very afraid of. "Let's find the traitor," Gianna said, her voice dropping into that same archaic, rhythmic dialect of her ancestors. "And then we take back the docks." The air in the sub-basement of the Moretti stronghold was thick with the smell of damp concrete and ozone. Gianna walked a few paces behind Lorenzo, her footsteps echoing hollowly against the narrow walls. After the hospital siege, the atmosphere had shifted from protective to predatory. Lorenzo was no longer the charming, tactical protector. He was a silent storm, his jaw set in a line of hard granite. He led her to a reinforced observation room equipped with one-way glass that looked into a stark, brightly lit interrogation chamber. "Stay here," Lorenzo commanded, his voice devoid of its usual warmth. "I need you to see this, to understand that the rot doesn't always come from the outside." Gianna pressed her hand against the cold glass. Inside the chamber, tied to a heavy steel chair, was a man she recognized, Carlo, the head of security who had been responsible for the perimeter at the Moretti estate. He was a man Gianna had initially trusted, someone who had offered her a sympathetic nod when she was first brought into the safe house. Now, he sat slumped, his face a mask of sweating terror as the heavy door creaked open and Lorenzo stepped into the light. "I gave you my father's life to guard, Carlo," Lorenzo said, his voice terrifyingly calm as he began to slowly peel off his leather gloves. "I gave you the location of the woman who carries the future of our family in her head. And yet, the Luccheses knew the exact floor, the exact room, and the exact minute our guards changed shifts at the hospital." "Lorenzo, please," Carlo stammered, his breath coming in ragged hitches. "They have my sister. Nico. He sent me a finger, Lorenzo. I had no choice." "We always have a choice," Lorenzo whispered, leaning down until he was inches from Carlo's face. "You chose to trade a Valente's life for a coward's peace. You didn't come to me. You didn't ask for help. You sold us." From behind the glass, Gianna watched as the interrogation unfolded, not with the brutal violence she expected, but with a cold, psychological precision that was far more unnerving. Lorenzo didn't scream. He simply laid out the evidence of Carlo's offshore accounts and the encrypted messages sent from the estate's own server. It was a masterclass in betrayal. Gianna felt a wave of nausea. She realized that in this world, loyalty was a currency that was constantly being devalued. "Who else?" Lorenzo asked, his voice dropping to a low snarl. "Nico couldn't have bypassed the waterfront sensors with just your codes. Who was the voice on the other end of the line?" Carlo shook his head, tears streaming down his face. I don't know his name. He's high up, Lorenzo. Someone who knows the old routes. Someone who remembers the purge. Lorenzo froze. He turned slightly toward the one-way glass, as if he could see Gianna standing there. The mention of the purge, the night the Valente family was slaughtered, changed the stakes. This wasn't just a modern power struggle. It was an old ghost reclaiming its territory. Lorenzo exited the room and re-entered the observation booth, the scent of cold sweat and iron following him. He looked at Gianna, his eyes searching hers. He's talking about an insider from the transition era. Someone who worked for your grandfather and stayed behind to serve the Morettis. A double agent who has been waiting 30 years for you to surface. My grandfather told me there was one man he never fully trusted. Gianna said, her mind flashing back to the recipes. He called him the Vulture. A man who managed the books, but never looked anyone in the eye. Enzo, Lorenzo hissed, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. My father's primary advisor. He's been the architect of our logistics for decades. The gravity of the situation settled over them. If Enzo was the traitor, then the Moretti family was compromised at its very core. Every safe house, every bank account, and every shipment route was likely known to the Lucchese's. We have to move now, Lorenzo said, grabbing Gianna's arm. If Enzo realizes Carlo has broken, he'll initiate a scorched earth protocol. He'll give the Lucchese's everything they need to wipe us out in a single night. Wait, Gianna said, holding her ground. If he's been watching the books for 30 years, he's looking for the physical ledger. He doesn't know I've decoded the ghost channels. He thinks I'm just a bloodline figurehead. She looked at the monitors, then back at Lorenzo. Let him think he's winning. Feed him a false coordinate through Carlo. Tell him I'm being moved to the old pier, the one that's actually a dead-end silt trap. If we can lure the Lucchese fleet into the Devil's Throat channel, the tides will do the work for us. Lorenzo looked at her, a slow, predatory grin spreading across his face. He saw it then, the strategic mind of the Valentes waking up within her. She wasn't just a waitress witnessing a crime. She was the architect of a counterstrike. You want to use yourself as bait, Lorenzo stated. I want to finish this, Gianna replied. For my mother, for my grandfather, and for the life I'm never going to get back. Let's give the Vulture exactly what he wants. Lorenzo reached out, his hand cupping the back of her neck, pulling her forehead against his. It was a gesture of intense, desperate solidarity. If this goes wrong, Gianna, there's no coming back. Then let's make sure it goes right, she whispered. Lorenzo stepped back into the interrogation room one last time. He didn't carry a weapon. He carried a phone. He placed it in front of Carlo. Make the call. Tell them she's going to Pier 47 at midnight. Do it right, and your sister lives. Do it wrong, and there won't be enough of you left to bury. As the call was placed, Gianna watched the pieces of the final game move into place. The traitor was exposed. The bait was set, and the nervous waitress was preparing to lead the most dangerous family in New York into the heart of a storm. The air at Pier 47 was thick with the smell of salt and impending rain, the kind of heavy industrial dampness that clung to the lungs. Gianna stood at the edge of the rotted timber dock, her silhouette illuminated by a single, flickering street lamp. She wore a heavy coat, her hands buried deep in her pockets, clutching the small, leather-bound book of recipes that had become the most dangerous object in the city. Behind her, the dark expanse of the Atlantic churned, the Devil's Throat channel hidden beneath the surface like a hungry predator. Lorenzo was nowhere to be seen, positioned in the shadows of a rusted shipping container with a sniper rifle and a headset, but his presence was a constant hum in her ear. They're entering the perimeter, his voice crackled, cold and precise. 3 speedboats, muffled engines. They're coming in through the secondary slip, just like you predicted. Do they see the beacon? Gianna whispered, her breath hitching. Enzo is leading them. He's using the false frequency we fed through Carlo. They think the ghost channel is open. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by the low, guttural growl of high-performance engines. Out of the fog, 3 sleek, blacked-out vessels emerged, cutting through the water with lethal intent. At the bow of the lead boat stood Nico Lucchese, the man who had erased Gianna's family. He looked exactly as her grandfather had described. A wolf in a tailored suit, his eyes reflecting a lifetime of cold-blooded ambition. Beside him was Enzo, the Moretti trader, holding a tablet that tracked their progress through the safe lane. The boats slowed as they approached the pier. Nico stepped onto the dock, his boots clicking rhythmically against the wood. He didn't look at the warehouse or the guards. He looked only at Gianna. 30 years, Nico said, his voice a dry rasp that carried over the wind. I searched every corner of Sicily and every borough of this city for the Valente ledger. I burned down half of Brooklyn looking for a book, only to find it's a girl standing on a pier. You didn't find me, Gianna said, her voice steadying as her Valente blood surged. I called you here. I wanted you to see the face of the family you couldn't kill. Nico laughed, a jagged sound. Bold, just like your grandmother. But bravery doesn't change the fact that you're surrounded. Enzo, check the channel. If the tide is right, we take her in the boats through to the secret depot. Enzo looked at his screen, a frown deepening on his weathered face. The depth readings are fluctuating in Nico. The signal says we're in the deep water lane, but the sonar is picking up silt banks. It's the devil's throat, Enzo, Gianna interrupted, her voice dropping into the rhythmic Sicilian dialect. The recipe for salted bass wasn't about the fish. It was about the sediment. At exactly midnight, the cross currents create a vacuum. If you aren't moving at 20 knots, the silt pulls you under. Nico's eyes widened. Move the boats. Get them out of the slip. But it was too late. A massive, groaning sound erupted from the water. The ghost channel was a geographical trap. The false frequency had led the Lucchese fleet directly into a whirlpool created by the converging tides and the crumbling underwater infrastructure of the old pier. The two trailing boats were suddenly sucked toward the pilings, their hulls shrieking as they were crushed against the barnacle-encrusted wood. Now! Lorenzo's voice roared in Gianna's ear. A flare ignited the sky, turning the pier into a surreal, crimson stage. From the shadows of the surrounding warehouses, Moretti's soldiers emerged, their weapons leveled. But they didn't fire. Instead, the heavy thrum of a helicopter approached from the south, its searchlight pinning Nico and Enzo to the dock. Federal agents. Drop your weapons, a voice boomed from sky. Nico spun around, his face contorting in a mask of pure rage. You call the feds? A Valente cooperating with the law? You disgrace your blood. I'm not cooperating with them, Gianna shouted over the wind. I'm using them. I gave them the coordinates to your illegal shipments and the evidence of Enzo's embezzlement. You aren't going to a grave, Nico. You're going to a cage where the world will forget you ever existed. Lorenzo stepped out from behind the container, his rifle slung over his shoulder, walking calmly toward Gianna. He stood by her side, his hand resting on the small of her back. Enzo tried to lung for Gianna, a desperate, final act of betrayal, but he was tackled to the ground by Moretti guards before he could even close the distance. Nico Lucchese stood frozen, the king of the docks reduced to a man standing on a rotting piece of wood, surrounded by the wreckage of his own fleet. As the FBI tactical teams swarmed the pier, Lorenzo pulled Gianna away from the edge. It's over, he whispered. The Lucchese name ends tonight. Gianna looked out at the churning water, where the remnants of the black boats were being swallowed by the silt. She felt a profound sense of weightlessness. The debt was paid. The wrong phrase at a dinner party had led to the right kind of justice. Let's go, Lorenzo said, guiding her toward a waiting car as the sirens drowned out the sound of the Atlantic. We have a new empire to build, and this time, we're doing it in the light. 1 year had passed since the night at Pier 47, and the salt air of the Brooklyn waterfront now carried a different scent. Not the stagnant rot of hidden secrets, but the fresh, metallic tang of industry and progress. Gianna stood on the glass-walled balcony of a newly christened Valente Moretti Logistics Plaza, a gleaming skyscraper that sat exactly where the old, crumbling warehouses used to rot. She was no longer wearing a server's vest. She wore a tailored charcoal suit, her hair pulled back in a sharp, professional bun. The Sicilian Renaissance, as the papers were calling it, had taken the city by storm. After the FBI raid, the Lucchese Empire had collapsed like a house of cards. With Nico Lucchese in a federal cell and Enzo's betrayals exposed, the power vacuum could have sparked a bloody street war. Instead, Gianna and Lorenzo had stepped into the gap with something the underworld had never seen: a legal alternative. The numbers for the third quarter just came in, Lorenzo said, stepping out onto the balcony behind her. He looked different now. The hard, predatory edge was still there, but the constant tension in his shoulders had smoothed out. He handed her a digital tablet. The automated shipping lanes are operating at 98% efficiency. We're moving more cargo legally in a month than our families used to smuggle in a decade. Gianna scanned the data. The ghost channels she had mapped from her grandfather's recipes were now the backbone of a high-speed, deep-water delivery network. By legitimizing the routes, they had secured government contracts and revitalized the Brooklyn docks. And the community fund? Distributed this morning, Lorenzo replied, leaning against the railing beside her. The neighborhood clinics, the school programs, it's all funded. My father still can't believe it. He spends his days at the vineyard telling anyone who will listen that his son is a legitimate titan of industry. The transition hadn't been easy. There were still those in the old guard who whispered that the Morettis had gone soft, but those whispers usually died out when they saw the sheer scale of the wealth being generated. Gianna had proven that information was more powerful than gunpowder. She had transformed her family's blood-soaked legacy into a shield for the city. Earlier that day, Gianna had visited her mother. She was no longer in a hidden hospital wing, but in a sun-drenched private villa on the coast. Though her recovery was slow, she was awake, her eyes clear as she watched the waves. For the first time in her life, she didn't have to look over her shoulder. The name Valente was no longer a death sentence. It was a badge of honor. "You're thinking about Matteo," Lorenzo said softly, sensing her shift in mood. "I'm thinking about how he spent 30 years in a drafty house in Queens, guarding a kingdom he thought was lost," Gianna said. "He died 3 months ago knowing the house was safe. He told me his only regret was that he didn't get to see me wear the crown." "You aren't wearing a crown, Gianna," Lorenzo said, turning to face her. "You're building a world. There's a difference." He reached out, taking her hand. The connection between them had evolved from a tactical necessity into something deep and undeniable. They were no longer just allies in a war. They were partners in a future that neither of them had thought possible when they first met in that tense dining hall. The sun began to set over the Manhattan skyline, casting a golden glow over the busy port below. Gianna looked down at the ships bearing the Valente Moretti crest. They had done the impossible. They had taken the shadows of the past and turned them into the light of the future. "Is everything ready for the gala tonight?" Gianna asked. "The guest list is cleared, the security is internal, and the wine is from our own vineyard," Lorenzo smiled. "And this time, if anyone uses the wrong Sicilian phrase, we'll just offer them a job." Gianna laughed, a genuine, light sound that echoed over the balcony. The nervous waitress was a memory, a ghost she had finally laid to rest. She was Gianna Valente, and the city was finally listening to her voice. The gala at the Valente Moretti Plaza was a vision of modern elegance, a far cry from the suffocating, shadow-drenched dinner party where Gianna's journey had begun. High above the Brooklyn streets, the floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of a city that no longer felt like a hunting ground. The guest list was a sophisticated blend of international shipping magnates, city officials, and the reformed remains of the old families who had traded their weapons for board seats. Gianna moved through the room with a natural, quiet authority. She stopped to speak with the port commissioner, discussing the new eco-friendly dredging project for the ghost channels, before excusing herself to find the one person who mattered most. She found her grandfather's chair in a quiet alcove near the terrace. Beside him, her mother sat in a silk wrap, her strength returning more each day. "You look like your grandmother tonight, Gianna," her mother whispered, taking her hand. "She always said the Valente women weren't meant to hide. We were meant to lead." "We're finally out of the shadows, Mom," Gianna replied, kissing her forehead. "The debt is paid. The ledger is closed." As the orchestra began a soft, rhythmic melody, the same tune from the lighthouse lullaby, rearranged into a celebratory waltz, Lorenzo appeared at her side. He didn't say a word, simply offering his hand. Gianna stepped into his arms, and they moved onto the dance floor. The room seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of them in the center of the world they had built together. "My father is in the kitchen," Lorenzo whispered into her ear, a glimmer of amusement in his flint-gray eyes. "He's trying to convince the head chef that the salted base recipe needs more ancestral spice. I think he's finally happy, Gianna." "He's happy because he has a legacy he can actually talk about," Gianna smiled. When the dance ended, Lorenzo didn't let go of her hand. Instead, he led her out onto the private balcony, the same spot where they had stood months ago to plan their revolution. The Brooklyn Bridge arched gracefully over the water, its lights reflecting in the river like a string of fallen stars. "1 year ago, you walked into my father's house as a ghost," Lorenzo said, his voice dropping into a rough, emotional register she rarely heard. "You were a girl with a tray and a dangerous secret. You could have run. You could have taken the money and vanished. I couldn't leave my grandfather." And eventually, she looked up at him. "I couldn't leave you." Lorenzo reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. When he opened it, the moonlight caught the deep, forest green fire of an enormous emerald set in antique gold. Gianna gasped, recognizing the craftsmanship immediately. It was the Emerald of the Docks, the ring that had belonged to the Valente matriarchs for centuries, thought to have been lost during the purge. "My father's men recovered this from a Lucchese vault after the raid," Lorenzo said, his voice steady but intense. "It was the only thing he insisted on keeping secret. He wanted it to go back to its rightful owner." He took a breath, the cold-blooded air of the Moretti line suddenly looking as vulnerable as the girl who had dropped her tray. "Gianna Valente, I don't want a strategic alliance. I don't want a business partner. I want a life built on the truth we created together. Will you build that future with me?" Tears blurred Gianna's vision as she looked at the ring, then at the man who had stood between her and a hail of bullets. The blood oath between their families, once written in betrayal and violence, was being rewritten in the light of the moon. "Yes," she whispered, her voice a vow that echoed the ancient dialect. "Zangu dei muntak zangu." Always. As Lorenzo slipped the ring onto her finger, the weight of the past finally lifted. The nervous waitress who had stumbled over a phrase was gone, replaced by a woman who had reclaimed her name, her family, and her heart. The Brooklyn skyline stretched before them, a glittering testament to what could be achieved when the shadows were finally forced to face the sun. They stood together at the edge of the balcony, no longer looking for enemies in the darkness, but watching the dawn of a new era. Thank you for following this story. If you enjoyed this journey from the shadows to the light, please leave a comment below. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more thrilling tales of legacy and redemption. From a nervous waitress in a lion's den to the queen of the Brooklyn docks, who could have predicted that one wrong phrase would change history? Gianna Valente's journey proves that your bloodline is more powerful than any shadow, but I want to hear from you. What would you do if you discovered your family was hiding a secret empire? Would you run, or would you take the crown? Drop a comment below and let me know where in the world you're watching from. I read every single story you share. If you want more high-stakes stories of legacy, betrayal, and redemption, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to join our family. Your support is the fuel that keeps these stories alive. Until next time, remember, some secrets are written in ink, but the best ones are written in blood. See you in the next story.